The Nintendo Wii released back in November of 2006, and like I've said many times before, it marked a huge strategy overhaul when it came to Nintendo's approach to making consoles. Rather than continue to follow what was considered to be the right path in terms of consoles at the time, the hardware specifications, Nintendo instead decided to veer off and forge their own path built upon the novelty of their ideas. And when it comes to the Wii, the idea that formed the basis for the whole console was of course the Wii Remote and its various different capabilities like motion controls, an on-screen pointer, and the easily recognizable shape of a remote. All these things, among others, combined to form what we now know as the Nintendo Wii gameplay experience. However, there was one big problem with how the Wiimote was designed and functioned. That being that it did not have the capability to play video games of a more traditional style. But during development, Nintendo no doubt realized this would be an issue rather early on, so they added a sort of fail-safe to the Wii Remote, also known as the expansion port. The expansion port, found on the backside of the device, gave you the ability to connect a number of peripherals to the Wii Remote, like the classic controller and the Wii Motion Plus, that would make playing games of different styles on the Wii more feasible. But of the various peripherals that could be attached to the Wii Remote, none were more prolific than the peripheral we're here to talk about today, the Nunchuk. The Nunchuk released alongside the Wii in 2006 and was considered so important to the overall Wii gameplay experience that it was even bundled with the console by Nintendo. In fact, many of Nintendo's biggest releases for the Wii, like The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword and Super Mario Galaxy, required you to use the Nunchuk if you wanted to play them. This was due to the fact that those games were designed with three-dimensional motion in mind, and what do you need to facilitate 3D motion? A joystick, which was nowhere to be found on the base Wii Remote. But other than the joystick, the Nunchuk also gave players a few more buttons to play around with, as well as left-handed motion controls for games that wanted to use both hands. It's a peripheral that, thinking back on it now, was much more important to the overall Wii experience than I initially thought at the time. I'd even go as far as to call it essential. But who came up with the idea for the Nunchuk, and what was Nintendo's philosophy when designing it? Well, that just happens to be the first big topic I'd like to talk about in this video, so without further ado, let's talk about designing the Nunchuk. If you've seen any of my other videos focused on talking about weird Nintendo peripherals, you know that when looking into the background of these devices, the first place I start looking is always the Iwata interviews that were conducted by the late great Nintendo president Iwata Satoru. And when it comes to the Nunchuk, that was doubly true, because the Wii was the first Nintendo console that was developed under Iwata's leadership. In fact, many of the earliest Iwata interviews were focused specifically around the Wii's development, so I knew that would be a veritable goldmine of information about the Nunchuk, and boy was I right. Let's start out by talking about what I found out about the initial idea for the Nunchuk. If you recall, I talked about a certain project within Nintendo that's purpose was to develop peripherals that could be sold alongside GameCube games back in my video about the DK bongos. Well, according to the Iwata interview focused on the Wii Remote, it turns out that the idea for the Nunchuk also came about from that same project. In this interview, Iwata asks a group of developers, "Would you please explain how the Nunchuk-shaped controller was born?" The one-handed controller alone was a very innovative idea, but I think it was very daring to have a different shaped controller in each hand and to have them operated separately. To this, Ashida Kenichiro of Nintendo's Integrated Research and Development Division, Product Development Department, Design Group, wow that's a long title, says, "I first heard about the idea for the Nunchuk from Takeda-san. He said, 'Can you try to make something like this?' There were also requests from the development teams for Metroid and other software titles asking for a new kind of controller that uses both hands that can offer a new type of gameplay." Takeda Genyo, general manager of the Integrated Research and Development Division, then chimes in to say, "This idea originally came from one of the young developers involved in the project I mentioned earlier, the one aimed at selling packaged peripherals with GameCube games. He never mentions who this young developer was, but at least we have a general idea of who came up with the concept for the Nunchuk." But other than the specific person who thought up the design for the Nunchuk, we also got another rather interesting bit of information from these quotes. That being that the Metroid team, among other game development teams, were asking for more functionality from the Wii's controller pretty early on in the development cycle of the console. That makes a lot of sense to me because, like I said earlier, the expanded functionality that the Nunchuk provides to the Wii gameplay experience is essential to many more traditionally styled games like those from the Metroid series. But the obvious problem of lack of functionality was not the only thing that Nintendo sought to solve with the addition of the expansion port on the back of the Wii Remote. According to Miyamoto Shigeru, We were also able to solve several problems at once with this idea of connected controllers. One of the other problems we have always worried about is expensive peripherals. Even if you want to sell a peripheral with a game that uses it, the end result is costly. In the case of the Wii, since the controller is wireless, the peripherals would also have to be wireless, and we were worried that this would make them even more expensive. It was then that this idea of connected controllers emerged, and we realized that we could just connect everything to the main controller. By doing so, we would not have to worry about wireless communication for the peripherals. So, even a controller like the action pad that is placed on the floor can just be connected to the main controller. The same is true for something like the DK bongos. In the course of a single meeting, we were able to visualize our goal. That's a problem that I and probably most consumers wouldn't think of when looking at how the Wii Remote and its many peripherals function. I'll admit that it would have been nice to have a wireless version of the Nunchuk because having the controller you're using in one hand tied to the one you're using in the other was sometimes a bit cumbersome for me personally, but I understand Nintendo's logic from an economic standpoint. However, we did get an official wireless Nunchuk of sorts from Nintendo with the introduction of the Joy-Cons on the Nintendo Switch. The left and right symmetric design of the Joy-Cons just being an overall better version of the Wii Remote and Nunchuk combo, in my opinion. But getting back on track here, let's talk about who actually designed the Nunchuk. We already know that the idea came from a young developer at Nintendo who participated in the peripheral development project, but based on what I've read, it seems like he wasn't the one put in charge of its development. That honor fell to the more senior designer at Nintendo we talked about earlier, Ashida Kenichiro. According to Iwata, when Ashida initially showed him the Nunchuk, he was rather anxious, and speaking on the reason for that, Ashida said, "Well, I thought it might not fit well with the streamlined designs of the console and controller. At first, I also considered a design similar to that of the remote. But since it was so obvious that the right and left hands are used differently, I realized that making the designs similar would just make it harder to control. When I asked for Takeda-san's advice, he reassured me that it was fine for them to be different since they would be used separately." Based on this, it seems to me like Ashida was the one doing most of the work on the development of the Nunchuk. I'm sure he got help here and there from other members of the team, but based on the way he talks about the Nunchuk in this interview and his presence here in the first place, I'd wager he played a rather big role in its development. Another interesting tidbit we can glean from this quote is that Ashida initially conceptualized the Nunchuk as something more akin to the Wii Remote, but decided against it for various reasons. Once again, as we've seen on the Switch, symmetric controllers can work very well, but I guess Nintendo just wasn't ready to try them out just yet. Personally, I think it would have been interesting to see how gameplay would work with two Wii Remotes as the main controllers. Would there have been two pointers? Would both controllers have had joysticks? How many buttons did the initial Nunchuk design have? Would it still have had motion controls? There's a lot of questions I have about how this would have worked, but sadly we don't have enough information about the Nunchuk prototypes to get the answers we need. At least that's what I would have said before I decided to spend a few hours poring over old Nintendo patents. Now, I wasn't able to find the Wii Remote-shaped Nunchuk that Ashida spoke about, but I was able to find a very early version of the Nunchuk that was still being developed as a GameCube peripheral. It connected to the remote in the same way the Nunchuk we know does, but it had a few key differences. For one thing, there were an additional 2 buttons located on the top of the device just behind the control stick that were of course not included in the retail version of the Nunchuk. Also, if you look closely at the joystick on this version of the Nunchuk, it seems to be almost identical to that of the one found on the GameCube controller. The expansion port differed from what we saw on the final version of the Wii Remote as well, seemingly covering the entire backside of the controller. This honestly looks a little awkward to me, so I'm glad they changed it for the final version of the device. Lastly, the C button had a more rectangular shape on this version of the Nunchuk, which makes it look a little bit more like a Joy-Con in my opinion. Now that's all there is for the base Nunchuk featured in the patent, but there were a few other alternative designs that replaced the joystick with some other form of control. There was one that had a D-pad, one that had a so-called slide pad that resembles the circle pad on the 3DS, one that had a separated D-pad like what we see on the Switch Joy-Cons, and even one that featured a touchpad. Personally, I feel like the D-pad ideas are pretty pointless as one already exists on the Wii Remote, and the touchpad probably wouldn't have worked out all that well. But the circle pad idea could have been interesting to see. Obviously, I feel like Nintendo made the right choice in going with the joystick, but it's cool to see what other ideas were thrown around as a possibility. But I think that's enough about what could have been. Let's talk about what's actually here. And by that, I mean it's time for my personal favorite segment, the one where I take apart a device and show you guys how it works from an internal perspective. First things first, in order to open up a nunchuck, you have to remove the two small screws located on the underside of the peripheral. These are both tri-point screws that will require the use of a specialized screwdriver. Once those suckers are out, you'll have to sort of force the upper and lower plastic pieces apart because they are held together with something akin to clips, but after you do that, there's nothing left between you and the internals. As the nunchuck is a relatively small and simple device, there isn't a whole lot to talk about here, but we'll at least go over what we can. First off, there's the control stick, which is made up of two pieces, the plastic protrusion that you actually use when playing, and the lower portion that is soldered to the board. This device seems to function based on two separate sets of switches, I guess would be the best thing to call them. When you tilt the stick in a direction, one or both of these two small rotating switches change between one of three possible options, those being no movement or center, and the two cardinal directions associated with that switch, either left and right or up and down. This change in switch most likely completes a circuit that tells the controller which direction you pressed, but I can't be sure unless I open this guy up, which would require me to destroy a nunchuck, and that's something I don't really want to do. Next up, we have the C and Z buttons that are on the front face of the controller. I've gone over how these types of controller buttons work many times in the past, but just in case this is your first time hearing me talk about them, I'll explain it once again. When you press down on one of these buttons, you're also pushing down a membrane underneath the button that has a small piece of conductive material on the bottom side of it. When this conductive material comes into contact with the board, it completes a circuit that tells the controller which button you pressed. One thing that I wanted to know about the nunchuck was how they handled having buttons on the front and a joystick on the top. And it seems they used a separate board for the two buttons that is wired to the main board of the peripheral through a few colored wires. It's not very elegant, but it works. And lastly, we have the two chips that are found on the top and bottom of the main board of the nunchuck. Let's start by talking about the one on the top. This chip labeled DEJBH35ALE906MLT is most likely the accelerometer made by ST Microelectronics that allows motion controls with the second hand. This is based off another patent I saw for the nunchuck that stated the chip on the top was the accelerometer. The chip on the bottom then would have to be the main processing chip on the board, and this theory is backed up by its larger size and close proximity to the in and out cables. In case you are wondering, this chip is labeled FNU RVL C401936EM03T. Looking up that number doesn't really bring anything up, but there are similar chips that are labeled as being small processors, so let's go with that. This chip is most likely in charge of reading inputs from the buttons, the joystick, and the accelerometer, and translating that into data to be sent to the Wii Remote that then sends the data to the Wii to use it for a specific game. So without this chip, the nunchuck wouldn't function at all. Now, other than the internal components, there is one other thing I'd like to mention about the nunchuck, and that is the resemblance it bears to the middle prong of an N64 controller. This has been brought up by a number of people over the years, so I'm in no way the first person to talk about this, but I found the idea very interesting, so I decided to include it here. If we take a look at an N64 controller's middle prong, we can see that it has a centralized joystick and a single button labeled Z on the bottom. The nunchuck also has a C button, but you can clearly see the similarity here. The best way to show how similar the two designs are is to look at each device from the side. Looking at the side view of the Nintendo 64 controller's middle prong, we can see an uncanny resemblance to what we see from the side of a nunchuck. It's almost like they just cut up an N64 controller and used that. The first time I heard about this theory and checked it out for myself, I instantly knew what they were talking about when I looked at my N64 controllers. The resemblance is just too close to be a simple coincidence. But anyway, that just about wraps things up from an internal standpoint. The nunchuck was a peripheral that, at least in my mind, was absolutely necessary to the Wii's gameplay experience. Without it, we would have had no way to play traditional games, which I personally tend to enjoy most, and in turn, we never would have seen much of the great games that people still love from the Wii to this day. It was a very simple solution to a very important problem, and for that, I've got to give Nintendo some credit. However, I do believe that the nunchuck as a concept is extremely weird. I mean, up until this point, it seemed like traditional gaming controllers had taken a hold on the industry and would never let go, but in came Nintendo with a couple of rods stuck together with a cord. You were literally using a set of nunchucks to play Mario and Zelda, and thinking back on that, I wonder why I didn't find that more strange than I did at the time. Now you might say, by that logic, are the Joy-Cons also weird? And to some degree they are, but the fact that the two halves make up a normal controller makes them pretty understandable. The Nunchuk, on the other hand, is not an exact half of a controller. It's something different entirely, which makes it much weirder in my opinion. It's like if one Joy-Con was as it is now, but the other was just the C-stick from a GameCube controller. I understand the logic that Asha didn't want to make them the same out of fear of confusion, but at the same time, I feel like making them different is also confusing, so why not just make them the same? It was a really weird decision, but you can't say the Nunchuk didn't serve its purpose. But I think I've gone on long enough for one video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the ride, and as always, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end, it really means a lot. It feels good to be back talking about weird tech stuff again after a few months, and I'm going to try to do these types of videos more often going forward. If you have anything in particular you'd like me to talk about, feel free to leave a comment and I'll see what I can do. If you enjoyed today's video, consider giving it a like, it's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out. I feel like I've been inspired by the Nunchuk, so I'm going to make the ultimate controller. You'll hold the right half of an SNES controller in your right hand and a SpongeBob plug-and-play in the left. And the two halves will be connected with a shoestring that doesn't do anything, but it looks really sick.